All right, well, here you'll recognize West Virginia on this map and a little bit beyond it. What this is a map is of watersheds of West Virginia. So watersheds are basins that drain all the water that falls within them down to one point, which is the lowest point. Here we're in the Greenbrier River watershed. So we're in this area here, we're near Hinton. Okay, so we drain to the Greenbrier, which flows into the New River, which flows into the Kanawha River, and over to the Ohio River. Now, I point this out because our highest mountains in West Virginia were formed hundreds of millions of years ago on the eastern side of the state. And there was ocean on this side of West Virginia. And so West Virginia has always eroded, always been higher than the land that it drains into. And as a result, we don't really have dinosaur evidence here in West Virginia because that's all eroded away over time. And that's also the reason why we hardly have any natural ponds and lakes in the state. Of course, there's always small ponds, wetlands. We also have vernal pools, which are wet areas that form in the summertime. But what we really have is moving water in West Virginia. And then, of course, we love to create ponds, and we also create lakes for recreation. So West Virginia is rich in ponds, but not very many of them are natural. Hey folks, we're here at the pond at Camp Waldo in Summers County, West Virginia, and I wanted to stop here and point out this pipe here. So the water coming into a pond is the influent, and a pond really needs some water exchange. It also introduces oxygen, so when falling water hits the still water, it turns in some oxygen, which is critical for the aquatic critters. They need to use oxygen to survive as well. So you can see right now it just rained, so the surface of the pond is pretty clear of any litter. So when before the rain, there's all kinds of pollen that settles on the surface of the water. There can also be later in the season, there can be a lot of algae floating on the surface of a pond. And the algae is really feeding off the nutrients that's flowing into the pond, which could be from animals, it could be from erosion from the soil. And then the algae uses those nutrients to really bloom on the surface of the pond. After it rains, a lot of that algae might sink, but it'll bloom again if those conditions are the same. A very important reason why it's important to keep algae off the surface of the water is that sunlight needs to reach the bottom of the pond, and that obviously the sunlight is food for the plants growing on the bottom of the pond. Even if we can't see them most of the time, they produce oxygen that the fish and other critters will use to survive. The condition when there isn't enough oxygen in a body of water is called an anoxic condition, like you may have heard in the Gulf of Mexico. There's a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico because there's so much nutrient pollution and algae blooms that eats up the oxygen.
So what we're looking at here on that bent over reed is what we call a damselfly. They look similar to dragonflies, but they're much smaller, and you can tell that they're damselflies by the way they fold their wings once they're landed. The dragonflies will hold their wings out horizontally, and damselflies will fold them back behind them. So you can see that one down there, its wings are folded behind it.
Okay, we've come upon a bird's nest. Look at that, isn't that beautiful? What kind of bird would you imagine be making its nest right by the pond in the middle of the cattails? Something else that might make its home here are small native bees. So these old stalks of the cattails, sometimes they have hollow pith. So see that hole right there? That's just enough space for a native bee to lay an egg and provision it with food to last the winter and then emerge in the spring. All right, we come upon some animal tracks. You see those? What kind of tracks are these? And why do you think this critter was over here by the pond? All right, what is this human evidence here? Why do you think this is hanging off a blackberry briar by the pond? Always make sure to take out everything you bring in.
So we're looking at a red-winged blackbird up in that tree. They are very common birds to find around wetland habitats and water. You can hear him calling. And one thing that I learned is if the male birds have a brighter and larger red patch on their wings, they are more likely to find a mate, because that is something that could attract predators. So if they're still surviving even with that bright red patch, it means that they're probably a pretty strong bird. So that is very worthwhile to female red-winged blackbirds in looking for a mate.
Here we've come upon a hole in the ground. What do you imagine this is being used for, and by what animal? Clams and mussels, which are both bivalves, also live in ponds. You can see this one here was eaten by a pond visitor, maybe an otter.
So we have a sycamore tree here. It is obviously a water-loving tree, since it looks like it's pretty much almost in the pond. They're pretty distinct in their bark. If you take a close look, you can see that it's kind of shaggy and flaking off. And you can see all the different colors. There's grays, browns, sometimes there's greens. And that shagging effect comes from the fact that the sycamore bark is not very elastic. So as the tree is expanding and growing, it has to shave off that outer layer of bark as it continues to get larger. And then something that I've just been playing with recently is these new leaves are very, very fuzzy, as you can see, but it sloughs off pretty easily. And then the undersides, I think, stay fuzzy all year round, but this layer of fuzz on the top will continue to rub off as time goes on.
All right, so we're looking at a dead sycamore leaf that fell last fall. And what I wanted to talk about is the function of leaves in a pond ecosystem. So this one's still floating, but you can see on the pond bottom that there's all kinds of dead leaves accumulating down there. And that provides a lot of habitat for different larvae and even amphibians at different times in their life cycle. But it's natural for leaves to accumulate in the bottom of a pond. And these trees, like the sycamore hanging over the pond, provides plenty of shade and cool water habitat for fish and other creatures. Now, looking back down here, if you look very closely, you might be able to see a little bit of an egg mass. Adriana, could you point towards that? Sort of floating in the water. It looks like a young frog egg mass, a little bit different color than the water and floating together. This is the kind of depth of water that frogs like to lay their eggs in. Right here we have a baby tulip poplar growing right by the pond. And you can see the leaves are pretty distinctive. I've always thought that these leaves, when they get a little bit bigger, look like the face of the Cheshire Cat. So this little tree right here can often be confused with poison ivy. It grows in a lot of the same places as poison ivy. This is a box elder, and it grows all throughout West Virginia. It colonizes pretty rapidly in disturbed areas, so along the edges of a pond or a field. It does like to be near water. Doesn't have to be, though. Okay, so this will end up growing into a tree. It's got a much stiffer stem and it will become a woody stem. And you'll notice also that it's got these reddish stems that go to the main trunk on the young leaves. Over here, you see a patch of poison ivy. You can see it's got shinier leaves. See that? The margins of the leaves are similar, but they never have woody stems. And the texture is different, though I don't recommend you touch them. And so one thing about poison ivy is that it can grow just about anywhere. It does prefer part shade, part sun, but you'll find it in the middle of fields. You'll find it in plenty of shade as well, so keep your eyes open for it. This young tree here is a willow tree. Willow trees can get huge. You can see its flowers are open there at the top. See that? Willows love water. It's very common to see them growing alongside ponds.
Newly emerged first year milkweed plant. As you can see, it's very short and small right now, but they grow to be, at least waist high in some cases, and it doesn't quite have its flowers yet. Those will come early or later in the fall or late summer. And as many of you probably know, it's a very important host plant for monarch caterpillars. They will be eggs on these leaves eventually, and those caterpillars will eat those leaves, and there's a special toxin in these plants that is not good for other animals, but the caterpillars are able to digest it, so it's a perfect plant for them. And other insects like the flowers when they bloom for nectar, and it's overall a very important plant that we should definitely be keeping around.
So this plant right here that's very round and smooth is a rush. Rushes really like to grow in or near water. And one handy saying that can help you to remember that this is a rush is that rushes are round, whereas sedges have edges. So sedge is also like water, but they have got triangular or edged stems. And grasses have joints. So grasses are jointed plants that often grow in bunches like the rushes and sedges do. So again, sedges have edges, rushes are round, and grasses have joints. Here's another view of these cattails. You can see some of last year's growth, the dead leaves, in with this year's growth, which is the green leaves. Those seed heads at the top that almost look like a hot dog on a stick are the seed heads that are made up of lots of tiny little flowers. And then they fluff out almost like a dandelion flower does. And those tiny little seeds get dispersed by the wind so that they can establish a new muddy, shallow water areas. And they can do this pretty successfully and aggressively. So you can see here it's very overgrown on this side of the pond, and the reason is that it was kept mowed, which is called a press disturbance, where it's maintained in a disturbed, kind of not natural state. And instead of trees growing back, these invasive plants kind of establish themselves instead. So this is an autumn olive with all the blooms open. I can smell it very strongly here. A lot of bees are visiting it. We also have some blackberry canes right here. And then there's also some multiflora rose, which is up here. Now, of course, blackberry is native, and it's about to flower. You can see here the clusters of buds are about to open. Now that we've taken a look around this pond, there's only one thing left to do, and that is to go fishing. Come on, Adriana, let's go.